Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he pulled the glowing horseshoe from his forge. The coal fire burned hot and steady in his small workshop on New Haven Colony. Outside his window, farmers worked their fields under the twin suns of this distant world. Most people here used machines for everything, but Jake loved working with his hands and the old ways his grandfather taught him back on Earth. The hammer felt good in his grip as he shaped the hot iron on his anvil. Each strike rang out like music across the quiet settlement. Jake had been the only blacksmith on New Haven for 5 years now. People thought his work was old-fashioned, but they still came to him when they needed tools that would last, or when their fancy machines broke down. He was finishing the horseshoe when he heard a loud crash from somewhere beyond the hills. Sound was like thunder, but the sky was clear. Jake set down his hammer and stepped outside. A column of black smoke rose from the direction of the old forest. Other colonists were already pointing and talking about what it might be. Jake grabbed his medical kit and jumped in his old ground vehicle. As the settlement's unofficial doctor for emergencies, he felt responsible for checking if anyone needed help. The drive took him through winding dirt roads until he reached the source of the smoke. An alien spacecraft had crashed into a clearing, leaving a deep scar in the earth. The ship was unlike anything Jake had seen before. Its hull was made of some kind of silver metal that seemed to shimmer even through the damage. One wing was completely torn off, and there was a large hole in the side. Jake approached carefully, calling out to see if anyone was alive inside. A weak voice answered, him in accented but understandable English. He climbed through the damaged hull and found the pilot trapped under a piece of fallen equipment. The alien was unlike anything from the few species that visited New Haven. He had green scaled skin, large yellow eyes, and was about the same size as a human. His leg was badly hurt, and he was bleeding from several cuts on his arms. "My name is Vex," the alien said as Jake carefully moved the equipment off him. "I am a trader from the Outer Rim. My ship's navigation failed, and I crashed here." Jake used his medical supplies to clean and bandage Vex's wounds. The alien watched him work with interest, especially when Jake used some old Earth techniques his grandfather had taught him for treating injuries. "You work well with your hands," Vex said. "Most species rely only on machines for healing." As Jake helped Vex out of the wreckage, the alien looked sadly at his damaged ship. "I am afraid this vessel will never fly again. The hull damage is too severe, and the metal is very expensive to replace." Jake examined the damaged sections more closely. The silver metal was incredibly smooth and felt different from any alloy he knew. "What kind of metal is this?" he asked. "Stellarium," Vex replied. "One of the hardest substances in the galaxy. It takes specialized quantum forges, costing more than your entire planet to work with it properly. Only the most advanced civilizations can repair Stellarium hulls." Jake ran his fingers along the twisted metal. Something about it reminded him of the meteoric iron his grandfather used to collect. That metal had also seemed impossible to work with until you understood its nature. "Would you mind if I tried something?" Jake asked. Vex looked at him with surprise. "You cannot be serious. Stellarium requires temperatures and pressures that your primitive equipment cannot achieve." But Jake was already studying the metal's grain structure where he had torn. He could see stress patterns that looked familiar, like the ones he had learned to read in regular steel. Sometimes the old ways work better than people think. Vex followed Jake back to his workshop, mostly out of curiosity. The alien watched as Jake heated his coal forge to its highest temperature. He selected his tools carefully, choosing hammers and tongs that his great-grandfather had made over a century ago. Jake cut a small piece from the least damaged section of Stellarium and placed it in his forge. Vex shook his head, convinced that nothing would happen. The metal needed quantum manipulation, not simple heat and hammering dot. But as Jake worked, something unexpected began to occur. The stellarium started to glow and soften, responding to the coal fire in ways that surprised even Jake. He could feel the metal structure through his hammer, understanding how it wanted to move and bend. Hours passed as Jake carefully shaped and formed the stellarium. Vex watched in growing amazement as the human blacksmith did what should have been impossible. Using nothing but fire, hammer, and anvil, Jake was actually working the legendary metal. When Jake finally finished, he had created a perfect patch for the largest hole in Vex's ship. The stellarium piece fit exactly and bonded seamlessly with the original hull when Jake applied heat and pressure in just the right way. Vex stared at the repair in disbelief. "This should not be possible," he whispered. "You have done something that requires technology we do not possess." Jake smiled and cleaned his tools. "My grandfather always said that metal has memory. You just have to listen to what it wants to tell you." The alien trader left New Haven the next day with his ship fully repaired. But he carried with him a story that would soon spread across the galaxy, about a human blacksmith who could work stellarium with nothing but coal fire and ancient tools. 3 weeks after Vex left New Haven, strange ships began appearing in the system. Jake noticed them first as bright dots moving across the night sky, too regular to be natural. The colonists gathered in the town square, pointing telescopes upward and wondering what the visitors wanted. Word of Jake's impossible repair job had traveled fast through the trading networks. Vex had told his story at every port and trading post from the outer rim to the core worlds. A human blacksmith working stellarium with primitive tools was the kind of news that made people stop and listen. The first ship to land was sleek and military in design. It bore the markings of the Zenturi Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. The Zenturi were known throughout space for their advanced metallurgy and weapons technology. They considered themselves the finest craftsmen in existence. Commander Zaraketh stepped out of the ship wearing the blue and silver uniform of the Zenturi military. She was tall and elegant, with pale blue skin and silver hair that marked her as one of the ruling class. Behind her came a team of scientists carrying equipment that hummed with energy. "I am looking for the human called Jake Morrison," she announced to the gathered colonists. Her voice carried authority that made people step back automatically. Jake pushed through the crowd. "That would be me. What can I do for you?" Kath studied him carefully, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You are the one who claims to work stellarium with primitive methods?" "I helped repair a trader's ship," Jake said simply. "Nothing more than that. Nothing more," Kath repeated. "Do you understand what you claim to have done? Stellarium is one of our most prized materials. We have spent centuries developing the technology to work with it properly." She gestured to her team, who were setting up a portable quantum forge in the town square. The device was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, all flowing curves and contained energy. It cost more than most planets made in a year. "I have brought something that will test your abilities properly," Keth continued. She opened a sealed container and pulled out a small bar of metal that seemed to absorb light. "This is void steel. Even we can barely work with it using our most advanced equipment." Jake took the metal carefully. It was heavier than it looked and felt cold even in the warm afternoon sun. Something about it reminded him of the meteoric iron his grandfather had collected, the strange pieces that fell from space and required special handling. "This came from the core of a dead star," Keth explained. "It has properties that make stellarium look simple by comparison. If you can work this metal with your primitive methods, I will believe your reputation has merit." The Zenturi scientists activated their quantum forge, and the air filled with a low humming sound. Energy fields danced around the device as it heated to temperatures that could melt most known substances. Keth placed a piece of void steel into the forge and began working it with tools that manipulated matter at the molecular level. Jake watched the process with interest. The technology was impressive, but something about it seemed wrong to him. The machines were fighting the metal, forcing it into shapes it did not want to take. The void steel resisted at every step, requiring more and more energy to bend to their will. While Keth worked, Jake carried his piece of void steel back to his simple workshop. He built up his coal fire and studied the metal carefully. Like meteoric iron, it had a grain structure that was different from earth metals. His grandfather had taught him that space metals were formed under conditions that did not exist on planets, and they remembered those conditions. Jake began heating the void steel slowly, watching how it responded to different temperatures. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But as he reached the highest heat his forge could produce, the metal began to change. Not softening like normal steel, but becoming something more flexible, as if it was remembering how to move. He selected his oldest hammer, the one his great-grandfather had made from iron that fell from Earth's sky. A hammer seemed to sing as it struck the void steel. Each blow sent ripples through the metal that Jake could feel in his bones. The void steel was not just being shaped, it was being awakened. Word spread quickly that both the alien commander and the human blacksmith were working with the impossible metal. Colonists gathered around both workshops, watching the contest unfold. The Zenturi quantum forge filled the air with light and energy, while Jake's simple fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Hours passed. Keth's advanced technology slowly forced the void steel into the shape of a blade, but the process was difficult and required constant adjustments. The metal fought back against every change, and several times the quantum fields destabilized completely. In his workshop, Jake found himself falling into the rhythm his ancestors had known for thousands of years. Heat, hammer, fold, repeat. The void steel began to respond, not fighting him, but working with him. He could feel the metal's structure changing, becoming something new and stronger. When Jake finally finished, he held a blade that looked simple, but felt perfect in his hand. The edge was sharper than anything he had ever made, and the balance was flawless. More importantly, the void steel seemed happy in its new form, as if this was what it had always been meant to become. Keth emerged from her workshop at the same time, holding her own blade. It was technically perfect, covered in energy fields that made it glow with power. But something about it seemed forced, artificial. Impossible, Keth whispered as she examined Jake's work. You have achieved molecular alignment that our computers could not exist. The stress patterns are perfect. The edge geometry is beyond our calculations. Jake tested both blades on a piece of stellarium that Vex had left behind. Keth's blade cut through it cleanly, as expected from such advanced technology. But Jake's simple-looking sword passed through the stellarium like it was not even there, leaving an edge so clean it seemed to have been cut by light itself. How? Keth demanded. Our technology is centuries ahead of anything humans possess. This should not be possible. Jake cleaned his tools and banked his fire. My grandfather used to say that metal has a spirit. Technology tries to break that spirit and force the metal to obey. But if you listen to what the metal wants, it will help you make something better than either of you could manage alone. Keth stared at the blade in Jake's hand. She was a military officer, trained to think in terms of threats and advantages. What she had witnessed was either the greatest technological breakthrough in galactic history or something far more dangerous. You should know, she said quietly. That word of your abilities will soon reach others. There is a warrior named Gordic the Unbroken who has never been defeated in 3 centuries of battle. He considers himself the greatest weaponsmith in the galaxy. If he hears about what you have done here, he will come." Jake looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Let him come. I am just a blacksmith trying to do good work." But Keth saw something in his eyes that made her believe that perhaps, for the first time in galactic history, Gordic the Unbroken might finally meet his match. The shadow fell across New Haven like a dark moon blocking out the sun. Jake looked up from his morning work to see the largest spacecraft he had ever imagined hanging in the sky above his settlement. The ship was black as space itself and shaped like a massive hammer with weapon ports that could destroy entire cities. This was the Ironbound, and everyone in the galaxy knew that name. It belonged to Gordic the Unbroken, the warrior who had never lost a battle in 300 years of conquest. The ship's arrival sent waves of fear through the colonists, who had heard the terrible stories of planets that defied the legendary fighter. Jake set down his tools and walked outside as the enormous vessel landed in the fields beyond town. The ground shook with each impact of its massive legs, and the air filled with the smell of burned earth and ozone. When the landing ramp lowered, it was like watching the mouth of some ancient beast open to devour them all. Gordic emerged first, and his presence made the air itself seem heavier. He stood 9 feet tall with 4 powerful arms, each one capable of wielding a different weapon. His natural armor plating was black as his ship, marked with scars from countless battles. Behind him came warriors from a dozen different species, all sworn to serve the undefeated champion. The colonists backed away as Gordic strode through their settlement, his footsteps leaving cracks in the pavement. He stopped directly in front of Jake's workshop and spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "You are the human who claims to work metals beyond his understanding," Gordic said. It was not a question. "I am Gordic the Unbroken. For 3 centuries, I have traveled this galaxy seeking worthy opponents. I have defeated the weapon masters of the Stellar Confederacy, broken the Forge Lords of the Crimson Nebula, and claimed victory over champions whose names are legend." Jake stood his ground, though every instinct pulled him to run. "I am Jake Morrison. I work with metal and try to help people. I do not seek fights with anyone." Gordic's laugh was like an avalanche. "You do not seek fights, yet your reputation challenges mine with every world it touches. The galaxy speaks of a human blacksmith who works impossible metals with primitive tools. Such talk diminishes my own achievements." More ships were landing now as word of the confrontation spread. Representatives from dozens of species arrived to witness what everyone expected would be Jake's swift defeat. The Zenturi came with recording equipment to document the end of human pretensions. Pirates and merchants placed bets on how long the fight would last. "I offer you a choice, human," Gordic continued. "We will have a contest of skill. Each of us will forge a weapon using metals of my choosing, and we will fight with what we have made. If you win, you may claim my title, my ship, and my accumulated treasures. If I win, I take your life and your world's freedom." Jake felt the weight of every colonist's fear pressing down on him. These people had families, children who deserved to grow up free. He could not let his pride doom them all. "I accept your challenge," Jake said quietly. The crowd murmured in shock. They had expected him to refuse, to beg for mercy, anything but agree to face the most dangerous warrior in known space. Even Gordic seemed surprised by the human's calm acceptance. "Excellent," Gordic rumbled. "I will forge my weapon from neutronium steel, a metal born in the heart of dying stars. It is so dense and powerful that only the most advanced technology can shape it at all." He gestured to his followers, who began unloading equipment from the Ironbound. The forge they assembled was a work of art and terror, incorporating technology from civilizations that had fallen to Gordic's conquest. Exotic energies danced around its core as it prepared to work with matter so dangerous that a single mistake could create a miniature black hole. Jake examined the piece of neutronium steel that Gortok offered him. It was smaller than his fist, but weighed more than his entire anvil. The metal seemed to bend space around itself, and looking at it too long made his eyes water. Yet something about its structure reminded him of the heavy iron meteorites his family had worked with for generations. "You have until sunset," Gordic announced. "Then we test our creations in combat," while the alien warrior began his work with quantum manipulation and stellar forges. Jake returned to his simple workshop. He built his fire carefully, using coal that had burned in his family's forges for over a century. The neutronium steel sat on his workbench like a piece of captured starlight, dense beyond imagination. Jake closed his eyes and let his hands tell him about the metal. His grandfather had taught him that every material had a story, a memory of how it was formed and what it wanted to become. Neutronium steel had been born in the crushing death of the star, compressed beyond normal matter into something new and strange. He began heating the metal slowly, watching for the subtle changes. That would tell him when it was ready to work. Normal techniques would not apply here. This required understanding that went deeper than technology, older than machines. Outside, Gordic's forge filled the air with controlled lightning and gravitational fields. His 4 arms worked in perfect coordination, each wielding tools that could reshape matter at the quantum level. The neutronium steel bent to his will through pure technological dominance, becoming exactly what his calculations demanded. But in his simple workshop, Jake discovered something that Gordic's computers could not measure. The neutronium steel remembered being part of something larger, something alive and burning. When heated with the patient rhythm his ancestors had used, it began to respond not as conquered matter, but as a willing partner. Hours passed. The watching crowd grew larger as more ships arrived from across the galaxy. Some came to witness Gordic's latest victory. Others hoped to see the impossible happen. The Zenturi commander Keth watched both workshops with growing amazement, beginning to understand that she was witnessing something that would change galactic history. As the sun moved toward the horizon, both weapons began to take their final shape. Gordic's blade was a masterpiece of technological achievement, crackling with contained energy and sharp enough to cut through the hulls of battleships. It represented the pinnacle of what advanced civilization could accomplish through the young application of overwhelming force. Jake's sword looked simple by comparison, but there was something about it that made even hardened warriors step back when he lifted it from his anvil. The neutronium steel had taken on a quality that seemed to exist beyond the normal laws of physics, as if it had become something more than mere matter. "It is time," Gordic declared as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The 2 weapons, hummed with different kinds of power as their makers, faced each other in the growing darkness. Around them, the galaxy held its breath and waited to see which would prove stronger, the technological mastery of 3 centuries or the ancient wisdom of human hands working with willing metal. The contest that would determine the fate of worlds was about to begin. The forging had begun at dawn, and now the twin suns of New Haven hung high overhead as both Jake and Gordic worked to complete their weapons. The contrast between their methods was like watching 2 different ages of the universe compete against each other. Gordic's quantum forge dominated the landscape with its massive size and terrible beauty. Energy fields that could power entire cities focused on the small piece of neutronium steel floating in its core. The metal was held suspended by gravitational manipulation, while exotic particles bombarded it at temperatures that matched the inside of stars. Computer systems more advanced than most planetary governments calculated every molecular adjustment needed to achieve perfect atomic alignment. The alien warrior's 4 arms moved with mechanical precision around his forge, each hand controlled different aspects of the quantum manipulation process, adjusting field strengths and particle flows with calculations performed faster than most organic minds could think. His natural armor plates shifted and reconfigured to interface directly with the forge's control systems, making him as much a part of the machine as its operator. Every few minutes, Gordic would pause to examine the neutronium steel's progress through sensors that could analyze matter down to the subatomic level. The readings appeared on holographic displays that showed stress patterns, molecular bonds, and energy distribution in three-dimensional detail. When the computer indicated a problem, Gordic would make precise adjustments that corrected flaws. Before they could develop, the blade taking shape in his forge was mathematically perfect. Each fold of the metal created exactly the right distribution of hardness and flexibility. The edge geometry followed calculations that had been tested in computer simulations millions of times. Every aspect of the weapon was designed to maximum theoretical efficiency. Meanwhile, Jake worked at his simple coal forge as his ancestors had done for thousands of years. He had built the fire using techniques passed down through generations, creating a heat that was not just hot, but alive with the breath of combustion. The neutronium steel lay on his anvil like a piece of captured night, dense and strange, but somehow familiar. Jake did not use sensors or computers to understand the metal. Instead, he relied on knowledge that lived in his hands and eyes, skills learned from watching his grandfather work iron that had fallen from space. He could feel the neutronium steel's structure through his hammer, sense its grain patterns through the vibrations that traveled up the tool's handle. As he worked, Jake talked to the metal as if it could hear him. He explained what he was trying to achieve, why certain folds were necessary, how the heat would help it become stronger. The watching aliens thought this was primitive superstition, but Jake knew better. Metal did have memory, and it responded to being treated as a partner rather than an enemy to be conquered. The temperature control Jake achieved with his simple fire amazed even the most advanced observers. By reading the color of the heated neutronium steel and listening to the sound his hammer made against it, he could judge temperatures more accurately than Gordic's quantum sensors. When the metal was ready for working, Jake knew it not from digital readouts, but from the way it felt alive under his tools. Each hammer blow rang out across the settlement with a musical tone that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone listening. The rhythm was hypnotic, like a heartbeat or the pulse of some great engine. As Jake worked, the neutronium steel began to change in ways that defied the understanding of the watching scientists. Instead of fighting the forging process like most exotic metals did, the neutronium steel seemed to welcome Jake's attention. It flowed under his hammer as if it wanted to take the shape he was giving it. The molecular bonds that should have resisted change instead reorganized themselves to support the new configuration he was creating. Commander Keth of the Zenturi watched both forges with growing amazement. Her people had spent centuries developing the technology to work with advanced metals through the application of overwhelming force. They broke molecular bonds and rebuilt them according to calculated specifications, imposing their will on matter through superior technology. But Jake was doing something completely different. He was not conquering the neutronium steel, but convincing it to change. His ancient techniques created conditions where the metal could transform itself into something new while retaining its essential nature. The result was not just technically superior, but somehow more alive than anything Zenturi technology could produce. As the day progressed, other observers began to understand what they were witnessing. The human blacksmith was not just making a weapon, but demonstrating a completely different philosophy of creation. Where Gordic used force and precision to dominate his materials, Jake used patience and understanding to achieve cooperation. The weapons taking shape reflected their maker's approaches. Gordic's blade was a masterpiece of controlled aggression, every molecule precisely placed to maximize cutting power and structural integrity. Energy fields danced along its edges, and the metal itself seemed eager to taste blood. It was a weapon, designed to overwhelm any defense through pure technological superiority. Jake's sword looked simpler, but carried something that made hardened warriors step back when they saw it. The neutronium steel had taken on a quality that seemed to exist beyond normal physics, as if the metal had remembered what it was like to be part of a living star. The blade did not glow with artificial energy, but seemed to absorb light and shadows in ways that hurt to look at directly. As the afternoon wore on, both smiths moved toward completion of their work. Gordic's quantum forge reached the final stage of molecular alignment, locking the neutronium steel into its ultimate configuration with forces that could bend space itself. Computer systems performed millions of final calculations to ensure mathematical perfection in every aspect of the weapon's design. Jake's final work was quieter, but no less intense. He folded the neutronium steel one last time, creating layers of density that should have been impossible with primitive tools. The metal sang under his hammer now, a sound like distant music that seemed to come from the stars themselves. When he finally quenched the blade in water that had been blessed by 3 generations of his family's work, steam rose like incense toward the darkening sky. Both weapons were complete as the first stars appeared overhead. Gordic lifted his blade from the quantum forge, and it blazed with contained energy that made the air itself seem to burn. Jake drew his sword from the quenching bath, and shadows seemed to gather around its edge like living things. The galaxy held its breath as the 2 smiths faced each other across the settlement square. One represented the pinnacle of technological achievement, the other the ancient wisdom of hands working in harmony with willing matter. In moments, they would discover which approach would prove stronger when tested in the oldest way known to thinking beings. The duel that would determine the fate of worlds was about to begin. Gordic's ship projected the combat arena using hard light technology that could contain the force of their weapons. The fighting space appeared as a perfect circle 50 meters across, its boundaries marked by walls of solid energy that glowed like captured starlight. Above them, viewing platforms materialized for the thousands of beings who had come to witness this historic confrontation. Jake stood at one edge of the arena, holding his simple-looking sword, while Gortak dominated the opposite side with his massive frame and crackling energy blade. The difference in their sizes was striking, but experienced warriors in the crowd noticed something that made them reconsider their bets. The human moved with a calm confidence that spoke of deep training, while Gordic showed the first signs of uncertainty they had ever seen from the legendary champion. 3 centuries I have fought, Gordic announced, his voice carrying across the arena. I have defeated the crystal warriors of Vega Prime, shattered the bottlenecks of the Steel Brotherhood, and broken armies that numbered in the millions. You are brave to face me, human, but bravery alone will not save you. Jake tested the weight of his neutronium steel blade, feeling how perfectly it balanced in his grip. I did not come here to fight you, Gordic. I came here to show you something different. The alien warrior laughed, a sound like grinding mountains. Words will not protect you from my weapons. He activated additional systems built into his armor, and energy fields began dancing around his 4 arms. Each hand now held a different weapon, from vibro blades that could cut through starship hulls to plasma projectors that burned at stellar temperatures. The signal to begin came from the Iron Downs computers, and Gordic immediately launched himself forward with the fury of a falling asteroid. His attack was overwhelming, all 4 weapons striking from different angles, while his armored body moved with speed that seemed impossible for something so large. This was the technique that had destroyed civilizations, the coordinated assault that no defense had ever withstood. Jake moved like water flowing around stone. His grandfather had taught him that the strongest defense was not to block an attack, but to be somewhere else when it arrived. The neutronium steel sword seemed to guide his movements, showing him exactly where each of Gordic's weapons would strike and how to avoid them without wasted motion. The first exchange lasted only seconds, but revealed something that shocked the watching crowd. Jake had not only survived Gordic's opening assault, but had managed to land several strikes of his own. His simple sword passed through the alien's advanced armor as if it were paper, leaving cuts that bled strange blue blood. Onto the arena floor, Gordic stepped back, staring at the damage in disbelief. His armor was made from alloys that could withstand the main guns of battleships. The energy field surrounding it should have deflected any physical weapon. Yet the human's blade had cut through everything as if it were not even there. Impossible, Gordic growled. No primitive weapon can penetrate my defenses. Jake looked at the blood on his sword with sadness rather than triumph. Your armor is fighting my blade, trying to resist and deflect it. But metal that works in harmony cuts through conflict without effort. The second exchange was longer and more complex. Gordic adjusted his tactics, using his superior reach and multiple weapons to keep Jake at a distance. Plasma bolts filled the air, while vibroblades created a deadly web of cutting energy. The assault would have destroyed a small army, but Jake moved through it like he was dancing to music only he could hear. His neutronium steel sword deflected plasma bolts back at their source and sliced through vibroblade projectors with cuts, so clean that they continued working for several seconds before failing. Each strike found its target with surgical precision, not seeking to cause unnecessary damage, but simply removing Gordic's ability to continue the fight. The watching crowd began to understand that they were seeing something beyond normal combat. This was not just a fight between two warriors, but a demonstration of completely different philosophies in action. Gordic represented conquest through superior force, overwhelming his enemies with technology and aggression. Jake embodied something older and more subtle, achieving victory through understanding and harmony rather than domination. As the battle continued, Gordic's weapons began to fail one by one, not through brute destruction, but through precisely placed cuts that severed critical connections and disrupted energy flows. Jake's blade seemed to know exactly where each device was most vulnerable, finding weak points that the original designers had never imagined could be exploited. The turning point came when Gordic activated his most powerful weapon, an energy blade that could cut through the hulls of dreadnought battleships. The device projected a cutting field so intense that it left glowing tracks in the air where it passed. No physical object had ever withstood its edge, and Gordic had used it to carve through planetary defenses that had stood for millennia. Jake met the energy blade with his neutronium steel sword, and something impossible happened. Instead of being cut in half or vaporized by the overwhelming power, his simple weapon passed through the energy field and struck the projector itself. The cut was so clean and precise that the device continued operating for a full second before. The critical components separated and the energy blade collapsed. Gordic stared at his failed weapon in shock. This cannot be happening. My technology is superior to anything your species possesses. You should not be able to resist me. I am not resisting you, Jake replied, breathing hard but still standing strong. I am showing you that there is another way. Your weapons fight against themselves because they are built on conflict and domination. My sword works in harmony with the forces around it, so it can pass through defenses that rely on opposition. The alien warriors' remaining weapons were failing rapidly now, their energy systems disrupted by cuts that seemed to target their very ability to function. Gordic found himself with only his natural weapons and armor, facing a human who moved like water and struck like lightning. In desperation, Gordic launched himself into a final assault, using only his claws and massive strength. For a moment, it seemed like his natural advantages might overwhelm Jake's skill. But the human blacksmith had learned something from his years of working with metals, understanding how stress and pressure could be redirected rather than resisted. Used Gordic's own momentum against him, guiding the alien's charge into a throw that sent the massive warrior crashing into the arena wall. When Gordic struggled to rise, he found the neutronium steel blade at his throat, its edge so sharp that he could feel it cutting individual hairs without touching his skin. "Yield," Jake said quietly. "This does not have to end in death." 4. The first time in 3 centuries, Gordic the Unbroken found himself defeated. But more shocking than his loss was the manner of it. The human had not broken him through superior force or technology, but by demonstrating a completely different way of thinking about conflict and creation. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the greatest warrior in known space slowly raised, his hands in surrender, his eyes beginning to understand what the human blacksmith had been trying to teach him all along. The arena fell silent as Jake stepped back from Gordic's defeated form, lowering his neutronium steel blade. Around them, thousands of beings from across the galaxy stared in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The undefeated champion of 3 centuries lay on the ground, his weapons destroyed and his armor cut to pieces by a simple human blacksmith. But Jake did not celebrate his victory or claim the spoils of conquest. Instead, he knelt beside Gordic and began examining the alien's wounds with the same careful attention he had given to the injured trader Vex months earlier. "Why do you help me?" Gordic asked, his voice weak with pain and confusion. "I came here to destroy you and enslave your world. By the laws of combat, my life belongs to you now." Jake used strips torn from his own shirt to bandage the worst cuts. "Because fighting was never the point. I wanted to show you something different, a way of working that builds instead of destroys." As Jake worked, he began to explain what he had learned from generations of his family's teaching. He talked about metal having memory and spirit, about the difference between conquering materials and partnering with them. He described how his grandfather had taught him to listen to what iron wanted to become, rather than forcing it into unwanted shapes. "Your weapons failed because they were built on conflict," Jake said as he helped Gordic sit up. "Every system was designed to overpower and dominate. But when you build something based on harmony and cooperation, it becomes stronger than the sum of its parts." Gordic listened with growing wonder as concepts he had never considered began to make sense. All his life, he had believed that strength came from the ability to impose his will on others. He had conquered worlds and defeated champions by applying superior force and technology. But this human had defeated him using principles that turned his own strength against itself. "Teach me," Gordic said suddenly, his words carrying across the silent arena. "I have spent 3 centuries learning only how to break and destroy. Show me how to build and create." The request sent shockwaves through the watching crowd. Gordic the Unbroken was asking to become a student of the human he had come to destroy. Representatives from dozens of species began broadcasting the news across their networks, spreading word of this impossible reversal throughout the galaxy. Jake helped Gordic to his feet and smiled. "The first lesson is the hardest one. You have to stop thinking of materials as enemies to be conquered and start seeing them as partners in creation." Over the following days, Jake's workshop became the center of a transformation that amazed everyone who witnessed it. Gordic approached the simple forge with the same intensity he had once brought to battle, but now focused on learning rather than destroying. His 4 powerful arms, which had wielded weapons of conquest for centuries, began learning the gentle touch required to shape willing metal. The alien warrior struggled at first with concepts that went against everything he had been taught. People, the Krill, had built their civilization on the principle that strength meant the ability to dominate others. But as Jake patiently guided him through the basics of traditional metalworking, Gordic began to understand that there was a different kind of strength in cooperation and harmony. Word of what was happening on New Haven spread like wildfire through the galactic communication networks. Ships arrived daily carrying craftsmen, warriors, and scholars who wanted to witness the impossible sight of Gordic learning human techniques. Many came expecting to see some kind of trick or deception, but they found instead a genuine transformation. Taking place, Jake established a formal school around his workshop, teaching not just metalworking techniques, but the philosophy that made them possible. Students arrived from species that had been enemies for millennia, working side by side at forges where they learned that creation was more powerful than destruction. The lessons went far beyond simple blacksmithing. Jake taught his students to listen to materials rather than fighting them, to work with natural forces instead of trying to overpower them. These principles applied to everything from engineering to diplomacy, showing that cooperation could achieve results that conflict never could. Gordic became Jake's most dedicated student and eventually his teaching assistant. The former conqueror discovered that helping others learn brought him more satisfaction than any victory he had ever achieved. His natural leadership abilities, once used to command armies of destruction, now guided students toward understanding and creation. The transformation of Gordic inspired changes throughout the galaxy. Worlds that had lived in fear of the legendary warrior began to see that even the most dedicated destroyer could choose a different path. Peace negotiations that had stalled for generations suddenly made progress as diplomats applied principles of cooperation instead of domination. Jake's school became a pilgrimage site for anyone seeking to learn the human approach to problem solving. The waiting list for admission stretched for years, but Jake insisted that the most important lessons could be learned by anyone willing to treat their materials and their neighbors as partners rather than enemies. The culmination of this new age came when Jake announced a special project that would demonstrate the power of cooperative creation. Students and masters from hundreds of different worlds would work together to forge a memorial sculpture that combined metals and techniques from across the galaxy. The project took 2 years to complete and involved materials that had never been worked together before. Each species contributed their most precious metals while sharing the techniques that made them special. Former enemies worked side by side, learning that their different approaches to metallurgy were stronger when combined than when kept separate. Finished sculpture stood 50 feet tall and incorporated elements from every known civilization in the galaxy. But more important than its physical beauty was what it represented. Proof that cooperation could create something greater than any individual effort. No matter how powerful, at the dedication ceremony, beings from across the galaxy gathered to witness the unveiling. The sculpture bore a simple inscription in human script that captured the lesson Jake had taught them all. The strongest steel is forged in partnership, not conquest. Gordic spoke at the ceremony. His words carried live to every inhabited world in the galaxy. I spent 3 centuries believing that strength meant the ability to destroy. But this human blacksmith taught me that true strength comes from the ability to create, to build something better than what existed before. Years later, Jake could often be found back at his original forge in New Haven, still making simple tools for the local farmers. But now he worked knowing that his lessons had spread throughout the galaxy, changing how entire civilizations approached the fundamental questions of power and cooperation. Students would sometimes ask him if he ever regretted not claiming the wealth and status that defeating Gordic could have brought him. Jake would smile and point to the memorial sculpture visible in the distance, where former enemies continued to work together on projects that made the galaxy a better place for everyone. I got something much more valuable than treasure, he would say. I got to see the strongest warrior in the galaxy discover that building is better than breaking. That is worth more than any amount of gold or glory. And in forges across the galaxy, the sound of hammers ringing on anvils carried a new rhythm, one that spoke not of conquest, but of cooperation, not of dominance, but of partnership between willing hands and understanding hearts.